this is Jen Rubin, editor-in-chief of the Contrarian. We are delighted to welcome Katherine Maher, who is the CEO of NPR. Welcome, Katherine.
Thanks for having me.
Well, we are all too familiar with the giant cut that the federal government has exacted. What exactly is the financial damage that's been done to NPR?
So great question. The answer is that to NPR, the damage has been somewhat limited, but to the public radio system as a whole, the damage is fairly significant. I'd love to start with the public radio system because I think that that's where most people first understand the direct impacts of these cuts. So NPR has 246 member stations. There are numerous other stations in public radio that are not members of NPR. What this means is that you have hundreds of stations across the country that are eligible for federal funding, or were eligible for federal funding, I should say. And the funding cuts that just occurred in Congress earlier this summer withdrew about $120 million per year in operating funds from those stations. What that means is that stations that operate, particularly in rural areas, tribal areas, that serve communities that otherwise would not have the resources to run their own stations, that are more highly dependent on federal funds, have lost anywhere from 30 to 70% of their funding. And that is a critical issue for their ability to continue to serve their communities everywhere from Alaska to Alabama around the country.
Now, there are some public philanthropies that we have read that are stepping up. Are they able to help fill the gap, if not entirely fill the gap?
So not entirely fill the gap is probably the place to start. I mean, it's a lot of money, and it's a lot of money in places that is not totally equally distributed. So there's some smaller stations that operate in places with a little bit more wealth, have a little bit more disposable income in their communities. Those stations have been able to increase the fundraising that they do directly. Stations in more rural areas, as I mentioned, tend to have a harder time raising that. We're very grateful to the public philanthropy that has stepped up over the course of the last few months. I'm sorry, it's been a very busy summer. And you may have seen reported just this week about a bridge fund that is being developed. We've been working with an organization called Public Media Company around how we can think about stabilizing those stations so that they have transition funds to be able to get from this remarkable loss of funding to a more stable place. Can it fill the gap entirely? No, it cannot. We as NPR are also contributing about $8 million out of our budget to fee relief to reduce the cost and impact of carriage of shows. But at the end of the day, we're still going to see contractions in the system. And this is part of the reality of the loss of funding. If these stations had been commercially viable on their own, they would have been able to build those models out over the years. There's a reason that the government invested for so long in this type of work, for the same reason that they build roads in places that few people drive, because when they're necessary for citizens, they are necessary.
Now, if some of these stations, God forbid, go out of business, that will reduce the pool of stations that can purchase programming from NPR. What does that then do to the other stations? Does that begin to burden them?
Oh, you hit the nail on the head, and it's a really astute observation. So you're right, we have 246 member stations today, and if smaller stations consolidate or if they're unable to remain as members of NPR, what is more likely is that we will have to contract as NPR. Now, we recognize that that is just sort of the reality of serving a membership organization is that we would have to think about what our services would be to a smaller group of members. That said, you come from producing news, you come from news gathering. The cost doesn't go down just because there are fewer people consuming it. It's still a very expensive proposition to be able to provide original reporting. And so what we're looking at is how can we become more efficient in terms of what it is that we're offering rather than passing that cost along to the rest of our stations, because that ultimately creates negative consequences for the whole system and could damage those that are either surviving, but perhaps a little bit more tenuously in the system as a whole. So we're trying to think about ways to be able to support that going forward through being more efficient with the work and what we produce.
Now, I'm glad you mentioned original reporting. NPR broke a very important story recently, which was the paper that was left behind in Alaska during the summit. So that's the way in which many people understand NPR, the breaking news, the really iconic programming analysis and commentary. But there's a different NPR at the local level and in these rural areas. Talk a little bit about what they do for their communities and how critical they are just in the daily lives of people, not only from a news standpoint, but from a health and safety and survival standpoint.
Absolutely. And I think that this is what makes us so unusual as a national media organization is that we are a local national hybrid. I talk to people all over the country who wouldn't know necessarily unless you ask them to think about it, that their local host is not sitting in Washington, D.C. That local host is sitting in their downtown or in their community center, and they're hosting that show. And it sounds just like they're in the studio with some of our national reporters. And that is something that we've achieved over time as a way of really being able to reflect the full diversity of the country so that we can report on issues like water rights. We can report on issues like state sports championships and also report on this national stories that people care about as part of being part of the country. About 1 in 7 stories on national air as NPR come from our local stations. We have 200 newsrooms across the country, about 3,000 journalists, and that's a really important part of this work. It's also important because if local stations close and can't support that kind of reporting, it becomes harder for us to be able to tell those stories. From Anchorage, that was a national local partnership with our colleagues in Alaska at Alaska Public Media to be able to cover the recent summit between President Trump and Putin. We like to have those kinds of partnerships across the country. What you also see is that NPR is only about 25% of the programming that happens on a radio station, public radio station in the course of any given day. The remainder is filled with, as you noted, local programming, public affairs shows, local journalism, the ability for people to hear directly from one another with call-in shows. Some of my favorites are the giveaways and swap shows that you have in communities where it's a great way for people to connect. That is part of what makes public radio so vital and such a vital service, and in times of emergency, really important. So there's 2 examples I always like to use from just recent history. One is from Asheville, North Carolina, partially because I was there to visit our station, and I have heard firsthand from members of the community how important it was. In the aftermath of Hurricane Helene, when Asheville, North Carolina lost internet connectivity, electrical services, water for more than 40 odd days, Blue Ridge Public Radio was able to provide information about where people could seek safe drinking water, where they would be able to go in the event of needing medical care, to connect with their communities about what was happening in terms of recovery. People really talked about it as being a life-saving service for those 2 weeks when it was difficult to get a cell phone service or to be able to connect with family members outside. People were able to go on the radio and let people know that they were safe, even if they couldn't physically get over down trees to get to one another. In Alaska recently, in fact, at the very time that the Senate was debating cutting public radio funding, there was an earthquake off the coast of Alaska that put 3 of our local stations directly in line with a tsunami warning. And that is the path of a potential tsunami. And some of our colleagues at those local stations stayed in the station at sea level to continue to broadcast over the air in order to ensure that their communities had the information necessary to go to safety until the all clear was issued. I think that that speaks to the incredible power of public radio in both as a warning system, but also in disaster recovery and response. And there's nothing like it. When television goes out, when internet goes out, when the electricity goes down, the radio is still there. It's why it's the thing that people turn on in disaster movies. It's not the only value we have, but it's a really important one in a country as large as ours.
So, if you're an individual and you like public radio, you've benefited from public radio, where should you send a donation? Should it be to national public radio? Should it be to your local station? What do you suggest people do?
I would say all 3. Or sorry, both. And I'm going to give you a third option, right? So one is to your local station. Absolutely. The second is to a station that you have some sort of connection to. Maybe you grew up in a small town. Maybe you know someone in your community that is important to you that grew up in a small town. And their life was enriched by access to public media. Maybe they learned about music or culture or the world in a way that they wouldn't have otherwise had. So some connection you might have. And then the third is to donate to our network, which is the NPR network as a whole, when you can go to npr.org and donate, and 50% of your donation will go to all stations and 50% will go to NPR to continue to provide the support to enable that network to be as strong as it is today.
Well, Katherine, thank you. Thank you for all you do. We hope NPR survives and thrives because Americans do depend upon it. And we'll be sure to check back with you as time goes on. Thanks so much.
So much, Jen.